Hey y'all, how's it going? So it's finally happened. I'm finally getting around to making the bodice for the Haunted Mansion dress. I'm super excited and ready for this project to be as over as it's going to be. We're on a time crunch, so we're gonna see how this goes. But just stick around with me and we'll get this thing done. First things first, as always, we have to pin out the pattern pieces. For this article of clothing, I had to pin out the lining as well as the fashion fabric, so here I am pinning out the black cotton broadcloth lining. Some of these pieces were cut out slightly differently from the fashion fabric just because they needed to fit a little bit differently onto the final garment. I'll get a little bit more into this in a little bit, but just know that not all of these pieces fit perfectly onto their fashion fabric partner. I like to rough cut out my pieces and then adjust them to fit later. Speaking of pattern pieces that didn't quite fit as normal, you actually cut out only to the waistline on the lining bits for the bodice. The bodice piece itself actually doesn't fit on this 45-inch fabric. So you cut out the lining pieces just down to the natural waistline and finish off those edges later. Then I had to brace myself to cut into this very expensive silk taffeta from Silk Baron. This taffeta is in the color Lovecraft, and it is a green and black shot silk. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the color name is perfect for this project, not to mention the colorway itself. As you can see, the bodice actually does fit on this roughly 60-inch wide piece of fabric. So I didn't have to piece anything, I just had to cut it out. This required a lot of crawling around on the floor, and my legs were very sore the next day. Once all the bits and bobs were cut out, I had to line all of my pieces. Some of these pieces had a partial lining that got sewn as just a regular interlining, treated as one piece for the rest of the construction process. Other pieces actually had multiple lining bits to them, such as the side piece here that you can see where I am lining the side, but I'm not lining all the way to the bottom. That's because another facing gets put in at that point. Once I had gotten all of the linings and facings stitched down to the way that they were supposed to be, I clipped the back facing. I am not great at remembering what parts need to be clipped, and I kept trying to use those big old scissors when I had these great unicorn scissors instead. The unicorn scissors probably are not meant for cutting fabric, but they do in a pinch, and my embroidery scissors were on my desk instead of at the sewing table. I really need to be more careful about that kind of thing. But I just clipped all of these corners and turned out the facing, and that led to a finished edge along the bottom on the back and the side back without me having to do any hemming. Did the same thing for the side back facings. As I mentioned, I didn't fully line the side back pieces because the facing came in two different parts. One part was actually the lining, the other part was a facing. Again, I clipped. I used the fabric scissors for this because the unicorn scissors don't cut through the fabric super easily. So I wanted to make sure that this was a nice clean cut. Then it was just a matter of flipping everything inside out. Actually, having the unicorn scissors be kind of blunt worked out in my favor this time because I didn't risk stabbing through the fabric or stabbing myself nearly as much as I would with a pair of regular embroidery scissors. Here I am stitching the side back to the back itself, just along this curved seam. It was a little difficult, but it got the job done. Then, because it wouldn't be the Victorian era without it, I pleated up the fabric. This is the lower back section, which actually connected kind of separately to the main garment. I just used a heat-sensitive white gel pen to mark the placement for all of the pleats. I found that on Amazon for really cheap, actually. Then it was a matter of getting the waistband. I basically cut the waistband to the right length and then pleated the lower back piece to fit the waistband. This took forever because every time I thought I had just about gotten it, it wasn't quite right. The pattern doesn't give any sort of pleat placement for this. This is just by eye, which was very frustrating when I was trying to get it done. The pattern also suggests that you just stitch the lower back to the waistband and then directly stitch the waistband onto the bodice. I did that, and then I realized that I really didn't like the look of it, so I was going to go ahead and finish off the waistband. The waistband is just a piece of black twill tape that I stitched on to the top of the lower back section, very carefully trying so hard not to hit any of these pins. Then I just turned the twill tape part of the waistband inward and stitched right back down that same line. This just finished off the top of the lower back and made it a little bit nicer looking on the inside. This may not have been necessary, but I was concerned that the fabric would fray and I didn't want to deal with that. Then I had to stitch down those pleats that I had marked earlier. This was pretty simple, just take one line, move it, pull it all the way up to the second line, and pin it, and then stitch it in place. The pattern has some directions on how best to do this, but I thought it was pretty simple overall. So here's the deal. Yeah. Here's the deal. Normally, I really like to just hold off on doing all of my hand sewing until I can do it all at one time. That's not going to be possible here. So I'm going to sit down and try to knock out as much of this hand sewing as I possibly can. I'm such a slow stitcher. But if I want this to look right, I've got to do it right, which means hand stitching. So I'm very behind on my YouTube and need to catch up, so guess I'm sitting in front of my computer with my hand sewing today. Not how I intended to spend my day. We're T-minus 5 days until I'm supposed to leave for this event. It'll get done. If only because I don't have a choice. At this point, I needed to stitch in the pleats in the side back to the back panel itself. This had to be done by hand to avoid any visible top stitching on the outside of the garment. I sat down with this to finish off those interior seams and sew those pleats down. Unfortunately, I didn't get any video of actually stitching the pleats down, but just take my word for it that I did it. I spent my time doing this watching the Oxbox Hallow stream and had a very good time. For anybody who might have also watched that stream, grow. After that, I quickly stitched in the waistband, just using some whip stitches, being very careful to only catch the interlining layer. This was kind of difficult at times, just because every time I thought I had just caught the interlining layer, I ended up not. I ended up going into the satin itself, and my fingers were torn up. If anybody knows of a way to prevent yourself from stabbing your finger on the underside, please let me know, because thimbles are great for the upper side of the fabric. Then I had to stitch the dart in the front. The way that this pattern was cut, I actually had to stitch the side front seam as just a dart. It was all cut as one long individual piece, which was a very interesting construction method, and I really liked it, other than the fact that the pattern piece took up a lot of space on the fabric itself, and I feel like there could have been a more efficient use of the fabric. As always, when I'm doing darts, I simply tie off the dart at the front to avoid bulk from backstitching. Then I used that same heat-sensitive white gel pen to mark out the darts on the front. This was a huge pain, but I got it done. And then I just stitched them into the project itself. The actual stitching wasn't too difficult. Marking it was. I really need to invest in some tracing paper for this kind of marking. Then I stitched the fronts and the backs to each other just at the shoulder seams. This was going to let me put in the facing later to finish off the front seam. I used green silk Gutermann thread for all of the exterior seams and a black cotton thread for any interiors. Once the facing was stitched together, the neck and the front facings, I quickly ironed them flat and ironed the seams open. This was kind of tough to do just because the neck facing especially was cut on the bias, which meant that those fabric likes to stretch a little bit. I then pressed the shoulder seams open and started getting ready to put the facings in. I pinned the facing on and got ready to stitch it down to the front of the garment. The fabric didn't quite line up, but that was okay. The way that the pattern was cut was a little strange, and I'm okay with it coming out this way. Quick zip through the sewing machine to stitch this facing down. And then I clipped the facing. I used the fabric scissors again for this just to make it a little bit easier for myself, but I trimmed the corners and then clipped into the interior corners to try to avoid having so much bulk along these seams. I also clipped around the curves of the neckline. And made sure to repeat that on the other side. Then I just had to flip the facing to the interior of the garment, and that meant that the front side was actually completely finished. The problem here was just making sure that the facing didn't really show. I didn't have time to go through and understitch, but that is on my list of things to do to finish off this garment when I get a chance. I quickly ironed everything into place, made sure to poke out all of my corners using my unicorn scissors. And just kept on ironing everything into place. Because this is all one piece, this was a very long facing and took a while to get just the way I wanted it. To finish off the front part, I just needed to pleat the front section of the bodice. This was pretty simple. The pattern showed where it needed to be pleated. This is on technically the side front, but because it's all one piece, it's the front. The pleats are actually backwards from how they are on the lower back piece, so that when they meet up, there's not as much bulk in the seam. It's a really interesting way to construct it, and I was very pleased with how it came out. Then just had to stitch the front to the back. I stitched the bottom parts, the tails of the polonaise together first and moved up. That way I could go ahead and get those pleats out of the way and done and not have to worry about messing those up later. Once the pleats were done, it was really, really easy to get through the rest of stitching the fronts to the backs. Just about everything on this polonaise is stitched at a 1/2 inch seam allowance as per the pattern, though for some of the pleats and the interior structural work I used a 1/4 inch seam allowance just to prevent those stitches from showing. Lining up at the arms was kind of tough, but we made it work. Good morning. It is Tuesday, and I leave Friday for the Renaissance Fair, where I'm going to be wearing my 1870s ensemble because, it's Time Traveler's Weekend, and I can get away with that. Last night was good. I got most of it done. We've got just a little bit more machine stitching to do, and then the rest is going to be all of the fiddly bits, which I'm not looking forward to. So, just got to get through work today, make dinner, and then sit down at the machine and hand stitch some stuff in there. At this point, I'm kind of prioritizing. There are certain things that absolutely have to get done by hand and certain things that I can hold off on and add in later. So, like, the boning has to go in because it's a structured garment. It needs the boning. But the lace trim detail around the neckline and the cuff, it's not the end of the world if that's not on there for the Renaissance Festival this weekend. So, just prioritizing stuff. I leave on Friday. There's a chance I'll be hand stitching in the car. It's a 3-hour drive to the Renaissance Festival, so we'll see. Wish me luck. I'm thrilled with how it's coming out so far. Like, I almost cried when I got to see it finished up. So we're going to be doing the boning has to go in, the hem has to be done, and the pleating on the elbow has to be done, but other things can wait. We'll see how this goes. It's definitely going to have unfinished seams on the interior, but surviving historical Victorian garments also have unfinished seams on the interior, so I'm not as concerned about that as I probably should be. Alright, let me get to the job that actually pays me, and hopefully I'll have an update for you tomorrow. After all of that, it was time to do the sleeves. Really quickly, really easily, stitch the sleeves together. I had to do both the outer layer and the inner layer the exact same way. Fortunately, these were straight seams. I did find that it was interesting. There's kind of an L shape to these seams, and you don't sew along that L part. It's just the vertical seams, not the horizontal ones that you sew up. It's a very interesting sleeve construction. This led to an elbow pleat later. Then I stitched the lining and the fashion layer together at the cuff. This way I would have a finished edge without having to do hemming and worrying about those stitches on the outside. I have to admit, the first time I turned this out, I thought I had sewn it wrong because the pieces didn't line up quite the way I expected them to. But no, it was just late, I was tired, and wasn't thinking straight. So I turned it out, ironed down the cuff to make sure everything was laying properly. I really need to get a sleeve board one of these days. Then I sewed in a row of gathering stitches along the sleeve head. And proceeded to stand in front of the camera while I was pinning the sleeves onto the dress form. I used that gathering thread to ease the head into the set, and then pinned everything as well as I could and got it back over to the machine where I stitched it all down. I did the first sleeve off camera just to make sure that I could actually do the thing that I was trying to do without worrying about getting it right, and I'm so glad that I did. then the machine stitching was done and it was on to just all of the hand stitching. The interior boning channels are made out of more of that same twill tape that I used for the waistband. I cut them to length and hand stitched them into place using a spaced back stitch. At this point, time was of the essence, and while I would have loved to have done a proper back stitch to add a little bit more strength to it, I just didn't have time to get it all done. Good morning. It's Wednesday. I don't know that I'm going to get this done in time. I really don't. The boning channels are taking longer than I expected them to, and then I still have to do the buttons and buttonholes and the hemming, and then there's some twill tape that goes into the bustle piece, and I'm going to be stitching on this probably in the car on the way to the Renaissance Festival. So wish me luck. We're gonna get as far as we can, and I'm aiming for 95%. If I can get all of the structural stuff done, I can wear it to the Renaissance Festival and then go back in later and add the trims and the lace and finish up the seams on the inside, even though most of them are going to be finished up by twill tape over the boning channels. But we're going to see what happens. Tonight's Dungeons and Dragons, so I should be able to spend some serious time sewing. But I should probably get to the job that actually pays me, and I'll do some stitching this afternoon. See ya. Once I got all the boning channels inserted, I just had to cut the boning to fit. I don't have the proper tools, so I just make do with what I've got. I stole my dad's wire cutters, I guess they are, and used those to cut out my spiral steel boning. Grabbed my boning tips, and then grabbed my chainmailing pliers to tighten the boning tips onto the bone itself. This is probably not the right way to do it, but it works for me most of the time, and it seemed to hold up in this situation. Again, I had very little time left. Once all the bones were in, I marked the placement of the buttonholes. The pattern says that the buttonholes go about every 1.5 inches down and about a 1/2 inch in from the edge of the facing. So I made a quick little template out of a sticky note and used that same white gel pen to quickly mark the locations for these buttonholes. At this point, I was panicking because I didn't know how to use a buttonholer foot, but my friend over at Bleh Fluffle was very encouraging and reminded me that honestly, it's not that difficult. I had not used a buttonholer since I was in high school, but a quick refresher course, a couple of test stitches, and I was able to use the buttonholer very, very easily. So Elise, thank you. You have saved me from a lot of extra hand stitching. Then I used my seam ripper and my embroidery scissors to open up all of the buttonholes on the garment. This was actually pretty satisfying. Last but not least, I had to finish off the details. I had to stitch on these pewter shank buttons that I had never worked with before. This was very interesting, and also these buttons were heavy, so not a whole lot to say here, just stitched them on really, really tightly. I also made some bows off screen to go on the elbows. So, it's Thursday afternoon. I'm finishing up my workday, or no, it's not Thursday, it's Friday afternoon because that's how this week has gone for me. I'm finishing up my workday, and as soon as I get off work, I have to run and pack up. I have this whole, like, packing list here for everything because I want to make sure that I have all of my costume bits and pieces. And I've got 3 hours in the car and a book light, so hopefully I'll be able to get some work done. The only thing that I haven't done that needs to get done is the hem. The original pattern says to put in bustle tapes, like tapes inside of the bustle to like hold the skirt up in a certain way. I don't think that's necessary. I'll add it later when I add like the lace trim and all of that fun stuff and replace the elbow bows. But I think I'll be able to wear this thing this weekend, and I'm super excited about it. Here goes. Much. I just want proof that I was stitching in the car.
As we were driving down the road.
Yep.
On I-40.
That looks really annoying. It is. So, after stitching for a very long time in the car, going 80 miles an hour, we finally have the finished garment. My friends and I had a fantastic time at the Renaissance Festival. I got quite a few compliments on my dress, and I had such an amazing time. There are a few things that I would love to fix on it, and I will, later, when I'm not burned out with this project. But until next time, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you later.